It's the latest talking point in the forever gun control push, and actually it's been on repeat for about the last year if you've been listening. Guns, not car accidents, not cancer, but guns are now the leading cause of children's deaths in this country.
Guns are the #1 killer of children in the United States of America. Let me say that again. Guns are the #1 killer of children in the United States.
Guns, as we know, is the leading cause that is killing our kids.
The leading cause of death of children, do you hear that, my Republican colleagues, is a firearm.
And every time that line is delivered with an agenda, of course. That was Biden last summer promoting his new gun control bill, and then Jean-Pierre repeated it just a few weeks ago after the Nashville shooting, because that bill last summer didn't do anything about it, apparently. The Safer Communities Act didn't make communities any safer, and so now we need an even Safer Communities Act, based on the same premise as last time. Whenever you hear these repeated talking points, you can bet there's some intentional propaganda in play. For a while, for me personally, I've had this filed under sounds like BS, but I'll look at it later to confirm. But since it's now being revived after recent news events and some new data on the topic, I figure it's time to learn exactly how and why this claim is so distorted and deceptive. Whenever this claim is made, it's almost always with reference to two sources. The first is a letter from 3 doctors at the University of Michigan to the New England Journal of Medicine last year, analyzing newly released CDC mortality data. The letter includes a chart that shows, see, look at that massive jump in firearm-related deaths from 2019 to 2020. Guns have surged to surpass car crashes as the leading killer of kids. And lately, that claim has been repeated with reference to a second source, a new analysis from Pew Research Center that shows that the problem only worsened the next year in 2021. Referencing CDC mortality data again, Pew researchers show, see, in 2021, gun deaths among children spiked again, now up 50% in just the 2 years after 2019. Now, before we even start with the specifics that make this propaganda point so misleading, there's some broader context to consider, even if these numbers were fairly presented. First of all, as a general rule, kids don't die. Statistically speaking, their deaths are very rare compared to the population overall, as you'd expect. According to the CDC, the mortality rate for kids ages 5 through 14 is about 14 per 100,000. For perspective, the mortality rate for the general population is 75 times higher, at over 1,000 per 100,000. Now, that's not to say that kids' deaths don't matter, or that we shouldn't seek to minimize them, of course. It's just to say that with numbers this low, even slight shifts in these deaths can appear dramatic. That's the same reason they were able to say that COVID was a leading killer of kids, after all, despite a microscopic mortality rate. When the benchmark is statistically 0, even the slightest increases make a big difference. Second point of context, guns, the variable this talking point implicitly blames, have stayed constant. There is nothing about them that's more available in recent years than they were in the years or decades prior. The data relevant to this claim are from the years immediately prior to Biden's most recent gun control policy moves, one by actual act of Congress and several others by executive order, when gun transfers have become more restrictive, not less. But in the years measured, there was nothing at the federal level to free up gun sales. From a regulation perspective, everything remained the same as it was in the years prior. Nothing changed. The third point of context is what actually leads us to the specifics. Whenever you hear these repeated talking points, it's crucial to think about the definition of the term. What is a child, or what is a kid, the terms they use interchangeably in this talking point? Because just like when they say there have been X mass shootings this year, you have to look at the definition of the term to realize it's so broad they're including cases where nobody even dies in private homes. And in fact, private homes are the most common mass shooting setting under some of their definitions. Or just like when they say X school shootings, they're counting dubious cases like an accidental discharge at a police academy in which nobody was even hurt. That's a setting where the gun discharge is much more understandable, obviously. Or just like when they say gun deaths generally, they're talking about mostly suicides, not homicides. With these very overbroad definitions, they're priming you to reach a conclusion that isn't actually reflected in the data. In this case, is no different. When you think of the term child, most likely you're thinking of something close to the dictionary definition, or at least the primary one, which is a prepubescent young person, as in a kid younger than the teen years. But that is not what we're measuring here in both cases. The doctor's letter to the New England Journal of Medicine and Pew Research's analysis, we are including teens up to 19 years old in the journal letter, and up to 18 years old in Pew's study. And in fairness to these publications, they didn't hide that fact. They're both open about including teens in their methodologies. It's the politicians pushing the propaganda who completely omit the terms teen and adolescent. They want you to think child, even though that's not what these analyses are measuring, at least not exclusively. They want you to think that the effect is on people younger than it actually is. Okay, yeah, but younger kids are still included in these numbers, so it's just a question of how these deaths break down by age then. And if the numbers are a pretty even split between younger kids and older teens, then the point still stands, right? Well, it is not an even split. The deaths that make this trend are almost exclusively among teenagers. 86%, in fact, nearly 9 in 10 of these deaths are among teens, more precisely, those ages 12 through 17, according to Pew's breakdown. And I bet, with data by individual year of age, we would find a skew toward the upper end of that group, as in more older teens dying than younger teens. As far as the actual children that this talking point is emphasizing, they are only a very small piece. Kids ages 6 to 11 make up only 7% of the total gun deaths among minors. Same with those 5 and under. So this trend is very demographically specific by age. And there's another drastic demographic trend. It's also very specific by race. According to a New York Times analysis of the issue from December, gun homicides among black young people under age 18 have doubled just since 2019, and that's unique. Gun homicides among Hispanic young people have stayed relatively flat for the last 20 years. Same with white young people and all other races. According to the New York Times, black young people are 6 times more likely to be killed with a gun than white young people, a point corroborated by the Pew analysis, which says it's 5 times more likely. In fact, if you look at the raw numbers, it appears that the increase in teenage black victims of gun homicide, just that single demographic alone, explains the overwhelming majority of this trend. The Pew analysis notes an increase of about 850 gun deaths among children and teens from 2019 to 2021. The New York Times doesn't give us specific numbers in this chart, but it appears the 2019 number of black young people killed by gun was about 900, up to 1,500 in 2021, a difference of 600. If the overall increase is 850 gun deaths among children and teens, and 600 of them are black, and close to 90% are teens, not children, something in the neighborhood of 70% of this trend is explained within the black teen demographic alone. So what's going on here? Has there been a sudden rise in shootings at all black schools? If there was, you'd be hearing about that nonstop on the news. And of course, if that was happening, we'd expect the numbers to skew younger than they do instead of skewing older. And if it is weird all black school shootings, it's also weird that it's all black male school shootings, apparently, because 83% of these homicide victims are young men. Given the specific and overwhelming demographic of this trend, black teenage males, there must be something going on within that specific demographic. Oh, but it's the guns. It's so obviously the guns. That's what we're supposed to believe. Well, the guns have stayed constant, but the problem is worsening, and not broadly, not in general, but almost exclusively within a very specific population that's relatively small in size. And if that's the case, well, it's fair to infer that the problem is quite localized. It's not happening everywhere. It's happening in very specific spots. If so, then we have to look at variables that changed in specific local settings. So if guns didn't change in the last few years, then what did? Well, John Sexton over at Hot Air has a good piece analyzing what the propaganda point does not: policing. Because we should all notice that the years in which this trend developed are the same years in which policing philosophy and practice changed rather dramatically. Several major cities seeing a decline in police on staff as a matter of both resignations in the face of public hostility to the job and as a matter of policy that cut those jobs from existence. And a lot of fact checks will insist that actually defund the police was just a myth, that in fact most major police agencies across the country increased their spending for police between 2019 and 2022. But of course, when we're dealing with a specific localized problem like these gun deaths among minors, it's not the national trends that matter, it's the specific local variables that do. And even if, in general, defunding the police was not a widely adopted policy, it was adopted to fairly drastic degrees in specific places. Major cities like Austin, New York, Minneapolis, Seattle, and Denver all making police budget cuts to the degree of 10% or greater. And those are just the police forced off the job. In many of these jurisdictions, police left the profession voluntarily, creating shortages and causing city leadership to beg them to come back. The bottom line, as Sexton notes, is that this supposed trend of kids getting killed by guns is really just a sub-piece of the broader trend of increasing violent crime in general. The rise in murders of minors mirrors almost exactly the rise of murders overall. Does that mean that changes in policing conclusively explain all of this trend? Not necessarily, but if almost all the change is within a very specific population, you have to look at what changed for that very specific population, and guns did not. So almost every piece and implication of this claim that guns are the leading cause of children's deaths is misleading or outright false. They want you to believe that it's children in general, that it's just a bunch of Uvaldes and Nashvilles happening all the time. It is not. It is teenagers in very specific locations. It is urban gang warfare getting less intervention than it used to. They want you to believe it's all about assault weapons. Jean-Pierre explicitly linked the two premises just weeks ago.
Guns, as we know, is the leading cause that are killing our kids. We've had this conversation back and forth about assault weapons ban. When there was one, we know that it saved lives.
Now, it is true that there has been an increase in rifle homicides that corresponds with the increase in homicides overall, but there just aren't enough of these rifle homicides to explain the hundreds more among these teenagers. Rifle homicides increased by 243 from 2019 to 2021. Even if every one of these new rifle homicides was a killing of a minor, which they aren't, that would explain only about a third of the increase in gun homicides among those 18 and under. These crimes, like all other gun crimes, are committed almost exclusively with handguns. And of course, they want you to believe that it's all Republican policy preferences that explain this trend.
Republicans in Congress need to show some courage. And if they had courage, they would be introducing legislation on on banning assault weapons today.
It's clearly much more attributable to their policy preferences. I say that not out of some party loyalty, but because the only variable that changed is the one for which they advocated, police reform. Republican gun policy preferences have not. And now, refunding the police may be part of the solution, but not to police the places where this crime is actually happening. No, instead, they'll be rehired to come after you, or at least Jean-Pierre isn't ruling that approach out.
Does the president support not just banning the sale and manufacture of semi-automatic weapons, but further than that, confiscation?
Let me just be very clear. What we're talking about, AR-15s, these assault weapons ban, they are weapons of war and they should not be on the streets.
But when they come to kick down your door, of course, your kids won't get the same sympathy. And when they've finally taken every AR-15 in the country, but this problem still persists, I'm sure it'll still be your fault somehow, no matter what the data say. Won't somebody please think of the children, by which you mean, won't somebody please think of teenage gang members in urban centers? Yeah, it might be nice if their fathers did that in the first place. Failing that, it might be nice to have a few police officers present to pick up the slack instead of sending them to my house where no crimes have been committed and no crimes will be. Failing that, it might be nice to be able to protect my kids from these killers myself, since deploying police to do that is no longer a fashionable policy. No, you misunderstand. We don't actually want the kids protected. We just want you disarmed, right? That's why this propaganda always has to become these convoluted lies instead of clear explanations of pretty simple truths. Deception is the game here, not reality. And the kids, like always, are just props in that act. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.